something came back with Artemis II. That's the claim a NASA engineer made in a private message that has since spread across half the internet, and the agency has not denied it the way you'd expect them to. They've issued statements about telemetry, they've talked about anomalies, they've used the word unexplained in a press release, which is the kind of word NASA only uses when the alternative is worse. Far worse. What followed our astronauts home from the moon is, depending on who you ask, either a piece of debris, a navigational ghost, a measurement error, or something that the people closest to the data are not yet willing to put on the record. Whatever it was, it held its position across 240,000 miles of empty space for 3 consecutive days. And when the astronauts splashed down safely in the Pacific, it was still there on the radar, steady and silent and completely unidentified. This is what we know. This is what we don't, and this is why the silence from Houston has lasted longer than any of the silences that came before it. Before we go any further, if you've ever looked up at the night sky and felt that peculiar mixture of wonder and unease that comes from realizing just how enormous and unknown the universe actually is, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel exists for exactly that feeling. Drop a comment below too. I want to know, does the idea of something following a crewed spacecraft home from the moon keep you up at night? Tell me your theory. Let's talk about it. The mission. Let's start with the mission itself because the context matters enormously. Artemis II launched in the early hours of an April morning in 2026, carrying 4 astronauts on a 10-day flight around the moon and back. It was the first crewed flight of the Orion spacecraft beyond low Earth orbit, the first time human beings had traveled past the Van Allen belts in over 50 years. Since Gene Cernan climbed out of the lunar module on Apollo 17 in December of 1972 and became, as it stands today, the last human to stand on the surface of the moon. Think about that for a moment. 50 years. A half-century during which the most ambitious thing our species did in space was orbit a few hundred miles above the surface of our own planet, building a station and conducting experiments, and gradually forgetting what it felt like to truly leave the cradle. Artemis II was supposed to be the moment we remembered. The mission profile was conservative by design. No lunar landing, no orbital insertion, just a free return trajectory, a wide, sweeping loop around the far side of the moon that used the moon's own gravity to slingshot the spacecraft back toward Earth. The physics of it are elegant in the way that genuinely dangerous things sometimes are. The crew would swing within a few hundred miles of the lunar surface, closer than any humans had been since Apollo 17, and then the moon would fling them home like a stone from a sling. They would see the far side, the side that faces perpetually away from Earth, the side no human eye had ever seen directly until Apollo 8 in 1968. They would float in their seats and look out the windows at a landscape that no living person had seen up close in 50 years, and then they would come home. It worked. The spacecraft performed within specification. The crew was healthy. The capsule hit the water within a few miles of the recovery ship, which is considered textbook accuracy for a translunar return. By every metric the public was given, Artemis II was a flawless rehearsal for Artemis III, the first crewed lunar landing of the modern era, scheduled for late 2027. That was the public version, the message. The private version started showing up in pieces about 3 weeks after splashdown, when an engineer working on the navigation team at Johnson Space Center sent a message to a colleague at Goddard Space Flight Center. The message was forwarded, then forwarded again, then forwarded to someone who wasn't supposed to receive it, who forwarded it to someone outside the agency entirely, and by the time it reached someone who screenshotted it and posted it to an aerospace forum at 2 in the morning, it had been read by enough people inside NASA that the agency could no longer pretend it didn't exist. The message described an object, or a signature, or a return. The engineer wasn't entirely sure what to call it, which is itself part of why the message stuck. Engineers are precise people. They deal in exact language because imprecise language gets people killed. When a navigation engineer at Johnson Space Center is not sure what to call something, that uncertainty is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a data point. Here is what the engineer wrote. Paraphrased, to protect the source, roughly 6 hours before the trans-Earth injection burn, the engine firing that committed the spacecraft to its return trajectory, Orion's tracking systems registered a second object in the same general region of space. Not docked to the spacecraft, not in collision trajectory, not close enough to trigger proximity alarms, but close enough and persistent enough that the radar return could not be dismissed as background noise. The object stayed with Orion for the entire return trip, 3 days. 240,000 miles through a region of space that is, statistically speaking, almost completely empty. That last detail is the one that keeps reappearing in every conversation about this, the Kyle of Ampinal space. If you've never thought carefully about how empty the space between the Earth and the Moon actually is, the scale of what was observed is genuinely hard to picture. So let's make it concrete. The average distance from Earth to the Moon is approximately 239,000 miles. That's about 10 times the circumference of the Earth itself. If you could walk in a straight line at a comfortable pace, say 3 miles per hour, it would take you roughly 9 years to cover that distance. If you drove a car at highway speed, 60 miles per hour, it would still take you about 166 days, non-stop, no traffic, no sleeping. The volume of space enclosed in the corridor between Earth and the Moon is not a tube. It's a vast three-dimensional region with a cross-sectional area of millions of square miles. The objects that occupy that space, old rocket stages, abandoned probes, impact ejecta from the lunar surface, chunks of asteroid that wander into the inner solar system and get gravitationally nudged into unusual orbits, are separated from each other by distances that would be considered enormous even on Earth. Two objects traveling independently through that corridor and ending up on the same trajectory, at the same speed, for 3 consecutive days, is not a statistical impossibility. Statistics is not morality. It doesn't deal in things that simply cannot happen. But it is the kind of coincidence that scientists do not reach for first, or second, or third. Orion covered that distance in 3 days, moving at speeds that peaked around 24,000 miles per hour during the fastest portions of the flight. That's roughly 31 times the speed of sound. At those speeds, the vehicle is not drifting, it is committed. Every burn is carefully calculated. Every course correction is a deliberate act that changes the spacecraft's future in ways the navigation team has modeled thousands of times. Whatever was tracking Orion had to match those speeds, had to maintain the same trajectory through a series of small course corrections that Orion's guidance computers were executing automatically based on real-time navigation data. Had to do all of this without ever closing the distance to the point of contact, and without ever drifting so far that the Deep Space Network's tracking stations lost it. That last detail is the one that keeps coming back. The object never got closer. It never got farther. It held its position relative to Orion like something that had decided, for reasons entirely its own, not to be left behind. There are 4 explanations currently on the table. None of them are clean. None of them fit perfectly. Each one has a fatal problem that the engineers keep running into when they try to close the case. The first is the simplest, and simplicity in engineering is always the starting point. It's a piece of the spacecraft. Specifically, it's a fragment of the European Service Module, the cylindrical section built by the European Space Agency that sits behind the crew capsule and provides power, propulsion, and life support for most of the mission. The service module sheds debris during normal operations. This is not a design flaw. It is a known characteristic of complex spacecraft in the thermal environment of deep space. Insulation panels can peel at thermal boundaries. Bolts can work loose under vibration. Small particles of frozen propellant can vent from relief valves and drift away as tiny ice crystals that catch sunlight and appear briefly on optical instruments. If a piece of the service module came loose at the right moment, say, during the trans-Earth injection burn itself, when the engine was firing and the entire vehicle was under significant stress, it could theoretically follow Orion home. The 2 objects would be riding the same momentum, separated only by the small force of whatever event released the debris in the first place. They could stay loosely paired for days before atmospheric friction at the edge of Earth's gravity finally separated them. This explanation has one fatal problem: the size. Whatever was being tracked was producing a radar return, consistent with an object several feet across. Not insulation, not a bolt, not a flake of paint. Something approximately the size of a domestic refrigerator, give or take, depending on the reflectivity assumptions used in the tracking calculations. And nothing that large is supposed to come off the service module during a nominal burn without the crew noticing through vibration sensors, attitude control anomalies, or thruster compensation logs. The spacecraft would have sensed it. The guidance computers would have flagged it. None of those were reported. None of those signatures appeared in the telemetry data. The second explanation is space junk, which sounds mundane until you think through the numbers required to make it work. There is a real and growing population of debris in what engineers call cislunar space, the region between Earth orbit and the Moon. Old probes from the Apollo era, discarded upper stages from Chinese, Indian, and Russian lunar missions. Components of the lunar prospector, the Elstros impactor, various small spacecraft deliberately crashed into the lunar surface over the decades that threw fragments back out into space at velocities high enough to escape the moon's gravity. A catalog exists. The Air Force's Space Surveillance Network tracks objects in cislunar space as best it can, though coverage there is considerably thinner than it is in low Earth orbit. The numbers required for a piece of that debris to have been in exactly the right place during Artemis II's lunar swing-B, to have been captured into a matching return trajectory, and to have then held that trajectory for 3 days without drifting are punishing. Not zero, not impossible, but punishing in the way that makes experienced aerospace engineers shake their heads slowly when they run the probability calculations and the critical detail. No entry in the surveillance catalog matches the observed trajectory. The object, if it was debris, was not tracked before the mission. It appeared, in the data, from nowhere. The third explanation is the one the engineer's original message hinted at without ever stating directly. And it's the one that makes the rest of the conversation complicated, because it comes in 2 very different versions, only one of which requires anything unusual. The quieter version, another country's spacecraft. China has a robust and rapidly expanding lunar program. The Chang'e series has successfully landed on the moon. The Qiqiao relay satellites are operating in lunar orbit. China's declared intention is to land taikonauts on the lunar surface before the end of the decade. In that context, a Chinese reconnaissance asset performing a close-range observation of the United States' first crewed deep space vehicle in 50 years would be valuable, understandable, and entirely consistent with the kind of intelligence gathering that every major spacefaring nation conducts. India landed its Chandrayaan-3 mission near the lunar South Pole in 2023. Russia, despite significant program setbacks, still has assets in cislunar space. Any of these programs could, in theory, have positioned a small reconnaissance spacecraft to shadow Artemis II during its return. If confirmed, that would be a serious diplomatic incident, which is precisely the kind of thing NASA would not announce publicly until it had been fully investigated and resolved through quiet diplomatic and military channels. The public would hear anomalous data consistent with sensor calibration issues, while the actual conversation happened in rooms that don't appear on any official calendar. The louder version of the third explanation, the one that carries more baggage, involves an origin that isn't any country's space program. This is the explanation that the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office exists to investigate. The office was formally established in 2022, absorbing the functions of the earlier UAP task force, and has since acknowledged on the record that a small percentage of reported incidents, from military pilots, from ground radar operators, from satellite tracking systems, resist conventional explanation despite systematic analysis. The office has not claimed to have identified anything extraordinary, but it has been careful, notably careful, to avoid issuing categorical denials. If something in cislunar space matched Orion's trajectory and held that position deliberately, and if that something is not Chinese, not Indian, not Russian, not a known piece of debris, and not a sensor artifact, then the remaining category in the taxonomy is small, and it is uncomfortable, and it does not get discussed easily in official NASA briefings. The fourth explanation is that nothing was there. Instrumental error, a reflection of Orion's own radar signal, bouncing off some quirk of the local electromagnetic environment, a processing artifact from the upgraded tracking software that flew on this mission for the first time, running on hardware that hadn't been fully characterized in deep space conditions, a ghost in the machine, the most mundane ghost imaginable, the kind that appears in data precisely when instruments are operating at the edge of their calibrated range. This is the explanation NASA's official statements seem to be leaning toward. The phrase used in the most recent press briefing was anomalous data consistent with possible sensor calibration issues. That is the language of an agency that wants to close a story, not open one. It is careful language. It is not a denial. The trouble with the fourth explanation is the confirmation structure. The object was not detected by a single instrument. It was detected by 3 independent systems operating on different physical principles. Orion's onboard proximity radar, an active system that emits pulses and listens for returns. The Deep Space Network's ground-based tracking array, a separate system that tracks objects by their effect on the spacecraft's known position relative to ground stations, and an independent optical telescope in Hawaii that had been tasked with imaging the spacecraft during its return, as part of a public outreach program, and which captured a secondary point source in the same vicinity. 3 instruments, 3 physical principles, all reporting the same thing in the same place at the same time. Sensor calibration errors do not typically replicate across three independent systems with no physical connection to each other. If they did, the concept of independent verification, which is the foundation of scientific measurement, would be meaningless. Astronauts. So what did the astronauts see? This is the part that's interesting because the official answer is nothing. The crew was not informed of the tracking anomaly during the flight. The decision to withhold that information was made by flight directors in Houston, and it is consistent with standard mission protocol for any non-actionable contact. The reasoning is straightforward. If there's nothing the crew can do about it, and the object is not on a collision course, and informing them of an unexplained tracking return would increase their cognitive load and potentially their anxiety without providing any actionable benefit, you don't tell them. They have enough to manage. The 4 astronauts on Artemis II have all been extensively interviewed since splashdown. They've given press conferences. They've appeared in documentary footage. They've talked to school children and senators and late-night television hosts. None of them have mentioned anything unusual. Either they were never told, or they were told and instructed not to discuss it. Those are the only 2 possibilities, and neither one is scandalous by the standards of how crewed spaceflight actually operates. There is one detail, however, that has surfaced in private conversations and refuses to go away. During the return trip, the mission commander asked twice for confirmation of trajectory tracking from Houston, twice within a 12-hour window. That is not a high frequency for a routine navigational check-in. Those happen on a regular schedule regardless. But the specific phrasing of the request and the fact that it was flagged in the flight log as notable by whoever was writing it suggests that the commander had a reason to ask, a reason that wasn't simply routine. The transcripts of those exchanges have not been publicly released. The flight log notations are available in the dry declarative style that NASA uses for everything. Commander requested trajectory verification, nominal data provided. What the commander saw through the window or on the nav display or in the raw tracking feed, if any of that was available to the crew's situational awareness systems, has not been described publicly by anyone who was in that cockpit. Put yourself in that seat for a moment. You are 200,000 miles from home. You are moving at a speed that would carry you from New York to Los Angeles in 7 minutes. Outside the windows of your spacecraft, the blackness is not the comfortable, familiar darkness of a cloudy night. It is absolute. The stars don't twinkle because there's no atmosphere to bend the light. They are hard and cold and perfectly still. The moon, which you just swung around, is now behind you. The Earth is a blue marble ahead of you, still 3 days away. You are in a corridor of space that no human being has occupied in 50 years, and on the tracking display, there is something that shouldn't be there. It's not close enough to matter. Houston says it's nominal, but it's there, holding its distance day after day, steady in the data the way a shadow is steady on a wall. You ask for trajectory verification, not because you're scared. Astronauts are not selected for being easily scared, but because you're thorough, because that is what you do when something in the numbers doesn't feel entirely resolved. Houston confirms nominal. You go back to your checklist, but the point of light is still there in the data. The precedent. There is precedent for this kind of thing, and that precedent is part of what makes the engineers nervous when they run into a fresh report. The Apollo missions had their own catalog of unexplained sightings, most of which were quietly filed and largely forgotten by the public until they started reappearing in declassified documents and interview transcripts decades later. Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11 reported seeing an object outside the spacecraft during the transit to the moon that none of the 3-person crew could identify. They reported it to Houston. Houston suggested it was probably the discarded upper stage of the Saturn V rocket that had propelled them out of Earth orbit. Aldrin checked the position of the upper stage in the navigation data. It was not where the object was. The upper stage was thousands of miles away. Whatever they were looking at was something else. In interviews given decades later, Aldrin said he still didn't know what it was, that he had at some point decided to stop trying to figure it out. That sentence, coming from a man with a doctorate in astronautics from MIT, a man who had orbited the Earth 66 times before walking on the moon, a man not prone to mysticism, carries a particular weight. Apollo 12 reported a similar object. So did Apollo 17. The reports were filed by the most thoroughly screened, most rigorously selected, most technically sophisticated human beings in the history of aviation. People who had been selected specifically because they did not hallucinate, did not panic, did not mistake ordinary things for extraordinary ones. Their reports were professional and consistent, and understated and filed without drama, because that is the Apollo culture. You observe, you record, you report, and you keep doing your job. Most experts today believe those sightings were debris, or ice crystals vented from the life support systems, or optical reflections off the curved surfaces of the spacecraft windows. And most experts are probably right. The mundane explanation is usually the correct one. But the pattern is suggestive enough that when a fresh tracking report comes in from a new crewed mission, the people inside NASA who remember the old files don't dismiss it as quickly as a casual observer might expect. They've seen this category before. They know that probably debris and definitely debris are not the same sentence, and they know the difference matters. The physics of what happened, the physics of the tracking observation is worth dwelling on carefully, because the numbers tell their own story, and the story is a specific one. To maintain relative position with the Orion spacecraft across a return trajectory of 240,000 miles, an object would need to have been in essentially the same position as Orion at the moment of the trans-Earth injection burn and would need to have received the same impulse, either from the burn itself if it was attached or very close, or from some independent propulsive capability if it wasn't. A piece of debris that happened to break off the spacecraft right at the moment of the burn could, in theory, ride along on essentially the same momentum vector. That is the debris hypothesis in its most favorable form. The fragment was close enough at exactly the right moment that the burn carried it along. The two objects would separate very slowly, a few feet per second relative velocity, and would appear on any tracking system to be moving together. But here is the problem that keeps appearing in the physics. Orion made 3 small course correction burns during the return phase. This is standard procedure. The free return trajectory is not perfectly precise. Small errors accumulate. The gravitational environment between Earth and Moon is not a simple two-body problem. The Sun's gravity, the Earth's slightly irregular gravitational field, the pressure of solar radiation, all of these create small perturbations that need to be corrected if the spacecraft is going to hit the narrow entry corridor it needs to survive re-entry. The corrections were small, on the order of a few feet per second of velocity change each time. But in orbital mechanics, a few feet per second is not a small number. It compounds across distance in ways that are counterintuitive until you've run the calculations. A passive object, a piece of debris, a fragment of insulation, anything that is not under active guidance, cannot match those corrections. It will drift away from the spacecraft's trajectory each time a burn is executed. By the first correction, it would be dozens of miles off the original path. By the second, hundreds. By the third correction burn, any debris that had started out paired with Orion at the trans-Earth injection would be so far from the spacecraft that it would no longer appear in proximity tracking at all. The tracked object did not drift apart. After each course correction, the object was still there, in the same relative position, within the precision limits of the tracking instruments. It either made the corrections itself, or it made something equivalent to the corrections, or it was, in some way, not yet explained, not subject to the forces that should have separated it from Orion. Passive debris does not adjust its trajectory in response to another vehicle's course corrections. Reflections do not adjust their trajectory. Sensor artifacts do not adjust their trajectory. Whatever was being tracked behaved as though it had an interest in remaining where it was. In aerospace engineering, when something behaves as though it has an interest, you start asking who or what has that interest. The investigation. The investigation, such as it is being handled by a small team inside NASA's Engineering and Safety Center, the office responsible for reviewing anomalies that don't fit standard mission categories. The center has handled hundreds of anomaly cases over the decades, ranging from the well-known to the quietly forgotten, the Columbia debris analysis, the mysterious thruster firings on the Genesis sample return mission, various tracking discrepancies from robotic deep space probes that resolved into mundane sensor issues after months of analysis. Most of these cases eventually resolve. Some of them end up archived under the heading "Unable to Determine," which in NASA's documentation language means, we looked, we couldn't find an answer, we're moving on. The Artemis II tracking anomaly is currently in the active investigation queue. NASA has confirmed this. They have not committed to a public timeline for the report. They have not named the object. They have not scheduled a press briefing specifically about this topic. The statements that have emerged from official channels have been worded precisely enough to be technically accurate while conveying as little information as possible, which is itself a form of information if you know how to read it. In the meantime, the data has been leaking in pieces through a network of engineers, contractors, and former agency employees who don't agree on what they're seeing, but who agree that something is in the data and that something deserves more attention than it's getting. The radar return sequences have appeared in at least 2 academic preprints as anonymized datasets, the source of which has been identified by people who know what those numbers look like. The Hawaii telescope's secondary optical detection has been independently analyzed by researchers at MIT and Cornell, neither of whom has published a conclusion, but both of whom have, in conversations, described the data as inconsistent with instrumental artifact. The Deep Space Network records have been formally requested under the Freedom of Information Act by at least 3 news organizations. Parts of those records have been released. Parts have not, citing ongoing investigation. What we have, assembled from the pieces that have surfaced, adds up to this. An object of unknown origin maintained relative position with the Orion spacecraft for approximately 72 hours during its return from the Moon. The object was detected by 3 independent instruments operating on different physical principles. The object's mass, composition, origin, and trajectory source are unknown. The object is not in the catalog of known cislunar debris. NASA has not publicly identified it. The 3 leading internal hypotheses, in order of apparent agency preference, are sensor error, debris of unknown origin, and foreign reconnaissance asset. A 4th category, listed in the leaked working document as unspecified, remains open. The presence of unspecified on that list is what space journalists and aerospace engineers with security clearances are quietly fixating on. NASA does not typically list explanations it has already ruled out. If unspecified is still in the working document, it means that, as of the time that document was written, the engineers responsible for identifying this object had not been able to definitively eliminate the possibility that it falls outside the categories of things they know how to explain. That is not a confirmation of anything exotic. It is, however, a candid admission that the known universe, as measured and catalogued and explained by our best instruments and our most careful scientists, did not contain a ready explanation for what followed Artemis II home. What happens next? What does this mean for Artemis III? The program is scheduled to continue. The first crewed lunar landing of the modern era is still on the books for late 2027. The hardware is being assembled at Kennedy Space Center and at the facilities of the various prime contractors. The mission crew has been selected, the training is ongoing, the mission profile, as of this recording, has not been publicly altered. Which is interesting, because if NASA genuinely believed that something hostile or hazardous was operating in cislunar space, something capable of shadowing a crewed spacecraft for 3 days without being identified, the responsible course of action would be to pause, to investigate before sending another crew to the same region, to at minimum understand what happened before repeating the conditions under which it happened. The fact that they are not pausing tells you something. It tells you that either they don't think whatever was out there poses a threat to crew safety, or they don't think it will repeat, or they think they can instrument the next mission well enough to gather more definitive data if it does, or they believe it was nothing, and the noise around a story that doesn't actually exist is manageable. That last possibility is the one NASA wants you to reach, and it might be right. Most leaks about NASA programs over the decades have turned out to be partial truths, misinterpretations of technical data by people without the context to interpret it correctly, or fabrications designed to generate attention. Space attracts mystery the way a porch light attracts moths. The gap between what people want to be true and what is actually true in the cosmos has always been filled with stories. Some of those stories are told by people who believe them. Some are told by people who don't. But the engineer's original message has a quality that's difficult to dismiss, and it isn't dramatic. It's the opposite. The message doesn't speculate. It doesn't editorialize. It doesn't reach for significance. It describes a tracked object. 3 independent sensor confirmations, a trajectory match that lasted 72 hours through multiple course corrections. That's the whole message. There's no flourish, there's no conspiracy narrative built around it. There's no attempt to explain what the object was or where it came from. Just an engineer who looked at data that he felt his colleagues ought to see and sent a message saying so. He has been suspended pending review. That is the official statement. He has not been fired. In agencies that deal with classified and sensitive technical data, the distinction between suspension and termination is not trivial. People who fabricate data, or who leak information they weren't authorized to share in ways that are judged to be malicious or reckless, get fired. People who raise legitimate concerns through inappropriate channels, who go around the official process because they believe the official process isn't moving fast enough or isn't taking the right thing seriously. Those people sometimes get suspended while the concern is evaluated. The fact that he hasn't been fired suggests that whatever he shared, he had legitimate access to. NASA does not preserve the careers of people who invent data. Where this leaves. Where does this leave us? It leaves us in the uncomfortable middle, which is where honest answers to hard questions almost always live. We know something registered on multiple independent tracking systems during Artemis II's return from the moon. We don't know what it was. The agency tasked with answering that question is, by its own public admission, still working on it. The engineer who first described it publicly is suspended and not speaking. The astronauts who flew the mission are not discussing anything unusual. The data that has surfaced is consistent with multiple explanations, and none of those explanations fit perfectly, and the investigation remains open. In the meantime, a small designation sits in a NASA database that translates roughly as presence confirmed, identity unknown. The Apollo astronauts came home with rocks and photographs and soil samples and a legacy that reshaped what our species thought it was capable of. Artemis II came home with a question, and not a small one. We're going to find out the answer eventually. NASA does not leave investigations open forever. The report will be written, the engineers will sign off on it, and a public version will be released with whatever caveats and redactions seem appropriate. It might say debris, it might say calibration error, it might say foreign reconnaissance asset, which would itself be a significant geopolitical story, the kind that doesn't stay in the aerospace pages. It might say something else, something that requires a different category. When that report comes, we will know more about what happened in the void between the moon and Earth during 1 week in April of 2026. We will know whether the silence from Houston was the silence of an agency closing in on a mundane answer, or the silence of an agency carefully managing a question it isn't sure how to frame. Until then, the only honest thing to say is, something was out there. It wasn't supposed to be there. It behaved in ways that passive objects do not behave, and the people closest to the data are not yet ready to explain it. Space has a long history of holding its secrets longer than we want it to. The dark between worlds is patient. It has been there longer than our sun has been burning. It has watched things that we have no names for come and go across geological time. While our species was still learning to make fire, it was not waiting for us. It was simply there. And when we finally sent our fragile machines and our fragile bodies out into it, we were very quiet and very small and very far from home. And something noticed. The investigation will continue. Artemis III will fly, and somewhere in a database, a small unresolved signal will wait for someone to finally determine what it actually was. The universe doesn't operate on our schedule. It gives us its answers when it's ready, and not a moment before. The engineer's message ended with a single line, not a warning, not a theory. Just an observation, dropped into a chat window late on a Tuesday night, weeks after the splashdown, by a person who had been sitting with something for too long and finally needed to put it somewhere outside his own head. 3 words, no punctuation, no follow-up. It went home with us. That's it, that's the whole sentence. 3 words. Think about what it takes to write those 3 words. Think about what you have to have seen, and thought about, and turned over in your mind, and been unable to resolve before you reduce everything to that. It went home with us. Whatever it is, it's here now, in the quiet space between Earth and the moon. Or maybe closer than that. We'll find out. We always do. Eventually. If this video made you question something, made you look up at the sky a little differently, or just gave you that peculiar chill that comes from realizing how much we still don't know, then please hit that like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to a channel like this one. Every like tells the algorithm that this kind of careful, honest investigation of space mysteries is worth showing to more people. And it is. And subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. We're going to follow this story as new information comes out, and we're going to cover Artemis III in the same depth, because when the next crew goes back to the moon, I want you to understand exactly what they're flying into, and exactly what might be waiting out there. Now drop a comment. I'm serious, I read every single one. Tell me, which of the 4 explanations do you find most convincing? Debris, sensor error, foreign reconnaissance, or something unspecified? What would it change for you if NASA confirmed it was a foreign spacecraft? What would it change if they confirmed it wasn't? Let's actually talk about this. The comment section exists precisely for questions that don't have easy answers. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.